Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky. Good evening, this is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Aileen Wuornos, a hitchhiking prostitute, shot, killed, and robbed 7 men in remote Florida locations. Arrested in 1991, Wuornos insisted she had acted in self-defense, but the jury condemned her to death, and she was executed in 2002. An abused runaway who turned to prostitution to survive, Wuornos had become iconic of vengeful women who lashed out at the nearest target. She's also become a touchstone for women's prostitutes and prisoners' rights advocates. Her story became the basis for the 2003 movie Monster, for which Charlize Theron won an Academy Award. Dear Dawn is Wuornos' autobiography, culled from her 10-year death row correspondence with beloved childhood friend Dawn Botkins. Authorized for publication by Wuornos and edited under the guidance of Botkins, the letters not only offer Wuornos riveting reflections on the murders, legal battles, and media coverage, but go further, revealing her fears and obsessions, her humor and empathy, and her gradual disintegration as her execution approached. Dear Dawn is the book that we're profiling this evening with my special guest, editor and author, Daphne Gottlieb. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, Daphne Gottlieb.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being on your show.
And I hope I pronounced your last name properly.
It's Gottlieb. You were really close.
Okay, great. Thank you for correcting me. Now, I ask a lot of authors, and it's probably one of my favorite questions. Why I ask every author. Tell us, without revealing very much about the project, why you became involved with this, because as probably the reader knows, and certainly every author knows, and certainly I know, it takes a lot of time once you've dedicated yourself to a project. It's not a whimsical sort of thing. It means a lot of time and dedication. What brought you to this project, and why were you interested in doing this project, Dear Dawn?
Sure, those are great questions. In this case, the why is a little different than the how. So I'll start with the how because that's easier. Dawn Botkins, who the book is written to, essentially, because all the letters are written to her, became the center of a lot of correspondences, because when Aileen was on death row, she had a number of pen pals, and as she sunk deeper into depression, she sort of started cutting people loose, but she did say, you can talk to Dawn. So Dawn started generating a lot of, long-distance correspondences, and one of these was with a woman by the name of Jessie Merrill, and Aileen had asked Dawn to promise her that she would get the letters out someday to tell Aileen's side of the story, and also hopefully make Dawn a little bit of money from the story, from Aileen's story. So Dawn had failing health due to her multiple sclerosis, and she called Jessie and said, can you help me with this? Do you know anyone who'd publish these? And Jessie has a friend by the name of Lisa Kester, who lives in San Francisco, who worked in publishing, albeit on the production side. So Lisa said, absolutely, I can absolutely work on that, but she needed someone on the editorial side, and that's where I came in. She knew me by reputation by virtue of my poetic work. I'm a writer, and this is my 9th book in print. Most of them are poetry, one's a graphic novel, and 2 are anthologies that I edited. And my work tends to focus around things I don't understand, particularly sex and death, I think, and love, because those are really difficult things, I think, to understand. And I come out of a feminist tradition to the point that I guest taught a women's studies class in Women Who Kill, And like I think most people, I have a fascination with serial killers, maybe a little more than the average person. But I think particularly women who kill, I was interested in because they are so different from the men who kill in terms of methodology, in terms of victims, and in terms, I think, of circumstance and race and class. The profile of a female killer is very different than I think most male serial killers. So Aileen, sort of the queen of them all at this point. I don't think there is another woman who killed who is as well known or as I think palimpsested. I mean, Aileen was used sort of to tell everyone's story, whether it was a prostitute story or if it was a women's rights story or if it was a sinners repent story. She became a very, very good vehicle. Everyone could sort of use that story to their own ends, and she got lost in it, which is why it became very, very important for me to help her in any way that I could get her words out, to let her be a full person again, to let her stop being sort of this cartoon with a big, gun that I think she's become. Or a perpetual victim, because I don't think she was that either. Right.
Now, take us back to Dawn and Aileen's relationship and where that started and how that blossomed, because that's very important for Aileen to be able to write daily, and Dawn was made the time, as she said, to write. So tell us about their relationship, how they became friends, and when this occurred, and tell us a little bit about, in this process, tell us a little bit about them growing up and what their life was like at that time when they met and how they became friends.
Sure. Well, they grew up in Troy, Michigan, which I'm gathering is sort of a suburb, about 45 minutes from Detroit, if I'm correct. I'm guessing a little on the 45 minutes. But in the subdivision, as the kids in the neighborhood would hang out at what they called the pits, which were sort of construction in progress, so they filled with water and were sort of like mini ponds. And Aileen had just started I don't know exactly what age she was, but it was young teens. She just started sort of hitchhiking around and doing drugs and drinking, and was part of this Troy gang, as she called it. And Dawn moved to the neighborhood and sort of became part of the Troy gang as well. And her brother, Ducky, became very, very good friends with Aileen's older brother, Keith. And so because Keith and Ducky were hanging out, Aileen and Dawn started hanging out as well.
Now, what were they up to at that age, even in terms of their behavior? What was Aileen like at that age when she had first met Dawn? And what was Dawn like at that age?
Well, I think Aileen was a lot wilder than Dawn in that she didn't. Dawn, had parents who sort of had a little more family stability. From the age of 11, Aileen's life, it's hard to put exact years on this, but it's rumored that it was at 11 that she started trading cigarettes for sex. And at 13, she was raped and got pregnant and was sent away to a girls' school so that she could have the baby, and it was given up for adoption. And so around the time, her life was a lot of turmoil and a lot of, fairly extreme circumstances. She was thrown out of the house after her grandfather's house. I can backtrack, but she was not raised by her birth parents. Her father, Leo Pittman, was actually in jail for rape and child abuse, and he was a pedophile, and he killed himself in jail. And her mother, Diane, abandoned her and her brother to her parents. So they grew up raised by them. So she didn't have a whole lot of family structure, and her grandparents, who were sort of her stand-in parents, were alcoholics. So there wasn't a whole lot of stability there. It's rumored that her father was abusive to her, and by rumored I mean she said only the nicest things about him, but in testimony, neighbors have testified that she was severely abused. So, as I said again, she really didn't have a safe place in the world, and she would frequently stay the night at Dawn, for example. Now,
the one thing that was in the book is that she had sort of a person that was in her corner, and that was her grandmother, Britta. And when she passed away, the grandfather, I guess, saw her behavior, her young teen behavior, and wouldn't put up with it and threw her out of the house. So, at the time that her and Dawn were friends, because I think it's important to describe this because this is quite unusual, even when you hear the history of serial killers or killers, that she was living outside and trading sex at a very, very, we're not talking about a sex worker, we're talking about somebody trading sex for a pack of cigarettes. So take us a little bit back about what was going on in her. You say she had a rough family life, but please elaborate because I think it's important to the story.
I mean, I'm not sure exactly what you'd like me to elaborate on. I mean, there's documented incident in court, the court papers about her being hit with a belt, but I don't know. I don't think many of the specifics of the abuse are known because technically her aunt, who she was raised as a sister with, Lori, has also refuted that there was any abuse, as has Barry, who is also her uncle, who was raised as her brother. And Aileen and Keith both felt that Lori and Barry got preferential treatment over her and Keith in the household.
Okay, well, I was just trying to say, basically point out that she was on the street at a very young age and on her own, as you had mentioned already, that basically had very, very poor family structure. But, I just found it kind of odd, even when I read the story initially, was that she was sleeping outside for the most part, and we're talking about, Michigan, so we're not talking about California.
Michigan winter, and she's sleeping in abandoned cars at the age of 15. It is unbelievable that this kid was washing up, and this speaks, to her strength and her, just her focus, that she would wash up in a pond, she says, before going to school, and that she still was going to school at that point, and she finally dropped out. But it seems like the way she talks about herself, she was a lifelong learner. She loved reading in particular, which, ironically enough, would serve her well in prison. But
yeah. Now, we're talking about teen life, and Dawn and Aileen are friends. How close are they, and what's this relationship? Does it sort of change as they go on in their teen lives? What's the dynamic of that relationship in their teen years?
They were extremely close, and it's my understanding that they were very, very close until they had a fight one day at a party, and that resulted in all Eileen's things being thrown out into the snow. And that was the point at which she decided to take off for Florida because she felt completely alone and friendless in the world, and also it was freezing cold, and there was no reason to stay, I believe. So she took off for Florida at that point.
And how did she make her way? What was she doing to make money?
Well, she was hitchhiking, she was prostituting, and she was given, I think, $80 by a social worker and then $100 by a truck driver, that she says in the letters, and I think that sort of started her journey. And after that, I think she was prostituting. She did have straight gigs here and there. She writes that she worked as a maid for something like $1 an hour until some guy offered her $50 for sex, and then she was done with being a maid. And I mean, I think that's a really funny anecdote, but it does point to the fact that she was doing survival sex, as you said, for cigarettes, for a place to sleep, for, she was using what she had to get what she needed to survive. This wasn't living high on the hog.
Now, when she was a young woman, was she, just to give people a mental picture, is this a soft-looking woman or a hard-looking woman? And was she, what was her physical appearance? For those people that didn't see Charlize Theron and do her appearance, what did she look like? What was her physical appearance? How big of a woman was she?
She was tiny. She was 5'4". I mean, 5'4" is nothing. She was a little wisp of a person, and she did gain some weight later on in prison. But I don't think until I started working on this, I appreciated how small she is. Her later photos, and if you look in the Nick Broomfield documentary, she looks extremely haggard, and extremely insane, I guess, really unattractive, past unattractive, really kind of frightening. But she was cute as a young woman. She was sort of perky looking and pert and blonde and little, and, I think that was really helpful to her in trying to find a way in the world.
Right. Now, what was her temperament like? Because, as you say, when you see photos later, you see this definitely looks like a wild woman and a woman that's been through the ringer, and by the time you saw the photo, she had literally been through the ringer and incredible prison experiences. But what was her temperament like as a teenager and a young woman?
Yeah, I get the impression that she was always mercurial, that she always had, a lot of lability to her mood, that she was, up one minute and down the next, and even in her letters you see that a lot. She'll start a letter furious and then she'll snap into, so how was your day? I think that, she no question, everybody agrees she had a serious borderline personality disorder. And, these things are evident in part, I think, as a response to trauma, and in part, they're somewhat organic. But that was in evidence pretty early, from what I can understand, in her life. So I think she was really proud of sort of her fiery disposition, of her fierceness. She told stories about bar fights, and she told stories about, all sorts of exploits where she was, the badass cowboy, essentially.
Right. Now, at what point did she meet Tyra Moore, and under what circumstances? And tell us a little bit about that relationship.
Okay, well, she met Tyra Moore, and I don't know the exact year off the top of my head. In a bar called, nuts! I'm blanking on the name of the bar. Oh dear! But they met in a gay bar in Florida, and actually this was right subsequent to Aileen having a breakup with a woman by the name of Tony, who was, she says, her first lesbian lover, and she and Ty were obsessively in love, and I think Aileen a little bit more obsessively than Tyra.
And what was Tyra doing at that time, and what was the sort of relationship in terms of not to get into who was the male in the relationship, but what was Aileen's sort of idea that she would have as her lover, and what would she do, in what was involved with all of that as well in terms of potentially taking care of her? What was her idea?
Well, I mean, I think, it's got to be revolutionary to be alone in your whole life and be kicked down and abused and find someone, who says, I love you, to someone who says, you are my world, you are my family. So I can only imagine what it felt like to her, probably for the first time in her life. And she was wanting very much, the impression I get is that she very much wanted to impress Tyria. So I know that she was very lavish. She had a lifelong habit of lavishing her friends or people she wanted to impress with money and with things. And Tyra was certainly no different. And eventually, Tyra, who I believe at the time they met was a forklift driver, but had also worked as a maid and worked at a lot of other sort of occupations. Aileen ended up supporting her because she wanted Tyra to be happy and comfortable. And so she ended up being the sole breadwinner. So there was increased pressure on her to churn more tricks so that they had enough money to survive for two of them now, not just one. On top of the fact that around that time was Desert Storm. And so a lot of Eileen's regulars, she said, were shipped off to the Gulf. So her regular client pool had been greatly diminished. So she was taking more chances than she otherwise would have.
Like, again, we talk about this client pool. How was she meeting these Johns? Under what circumstances? How would she meet them?
You know, she had a really interesting methodology, and she had some very, very odd shame about sex work, in that she didn't want to be seen as, you know, a high-heeled, fishnet stockinged prostitute. She did what she called her hitchhiking method. And she would actually dress down in shorts and sneakers and T-shirt, and, you know, she would say, you know, my car broke down, can you give me a ride to the next town? And then she would, you know, proposition the guy halfway there.
Okay. So now, did Tyria understand what Aileen did for a living?
Absolutely understood that. And I think she was very ambivalent about it. But, you know, I have no real way of knowing what she felt or thought about it.
Right. But certainly she knew what was going on. I mean, there was no naivety in her part.
She knew that Aileen was doing sex work, absolutely.
Right. Now, was there any event? Again, everyone looks for this sort of trigger, but at what point in the relationship, roughly, was it that Aileen killed a man, and from there a progression of other men, including the 7 victims? So at what point, and was there any event that happened around the time before that would maybe be considered some sort of trigger, or at least that's the event that came just before the onslaught? Is there anything like that?
You know, not that I know of in particular. I do know that, as I said, you know, there was additional pressure on her to make more money. She and Ty had a difficult time keeping a steady place to live. They were in and out of sort of transient hotels, and they had 3 animals. Actually 4 animals. They had 3 cats and a dog. And so they would get in trouble for the animals' noise, and they'd get thrown out, or they would, you know, not be able to pay, and they'd get thrown out. Or so they very much were scrambling for shelter frequently. And as I said, because a number of Aileen's client base had been shipped off, things were especially tight. And I think around the time of the murders, I think she said it had been raining also. So again, you know, and she didn't do very well in the rain, I guess.
From my recollection, and I pardon me for doing this, but what it seemed to be in Lethal Intent with Sue Russell is that there was a time when Tyria, like you said, the first person that she thought genuinely loved her in her whole life, and it seemed like from everything I've read about this case is that that's what Aileen Wuornos really was. A person desperately seeking attention, seeking to be loved, to be respected. She never got it from her family. She never got it from the people who loved her. They just either passed away way too early. She just seemed to be really, really seeking this in a very, I don't know, somewhat immature way. And then her bouts of temper, she seemed to be very protective, yet she was acting like a jerk, really, in a lot of ways. But the trigger that it seemed to be around the time of these murders, not to say that this is the cause and effect, but that she sensed that Tyria Moore might be slipping away. That was someone else came into the picture that was giving her a little bit more attention. They've been kicked out of a bunch of places, and it was because of Aileen's behavior. So I just put that in there because I'm interested in this story, and it's, again, a very fascinating story. That's why so much has been done about it. So anyway, at this time when Aileen kills her the first man, the letters that you have put in this book she talks specifically about that, and it becomes an important part of the defense later, or at least the attempt to talk about. She always claimed that this person tried to rape her. Tell us a little bit about what's contained in her letters about that event itself.
Well, I mean, she sort of gives a very painful play-by-play of what happened in the incident. And she, details down to the condition of the car and how she was held captive in the car, and, different substances, including alcohol and Visine, that were introduced into her body when the orifices were raw. And, really, really harrowing story.
Yeah, because, I think, to be fair to our audience, too, that a lot of, you must have noticed this yourself, there's a mix of the truth and stories and near truths in a lot of her letters. Is that sort of fair?
Absolutely fair.
And she does, as you talk about and other people have talked about, she vacillates. Basically, sometimes depends on the year or the time or the circumstance, or that some stories get changed. Isn't that as well correct?
That's absolutely true, and I think it's one of the fascinating and really captivating things about her is how malleable things are. I don't think she's as in control as someone who's willfully manipulative. I don't think she is directly trying to lie or get one over on anyone. I really think that she calls it like she sees it, and I think situationally things change the way she sees a lot, if that makes sense. Right,
yes. Now, for our audience to get back, make sure that they understand this story, because it's very multi-layered, because we haven't even got into the other players that, as she gets arrested, all these other players come into play, and in an unusual way, too. I've covered a lot of cases, and there's been some where obviously people are wanting to make, write books and do films, but this one really had a lot of attention and a lot of people that really shouldn't have been involved in like that, in anything like that, just for impropriety's sake. They were involved, so we'll get to that too, and that's very interesting. And of course, Aileen might be naive, and she might be, insane at sometimes, but she's not stupid, and she can see some of this stuff. She can see most everything. Now, she kills 7 men in a short period of time. What is the time period? Less than a year, isn't it?
Yeah, it is almost exactly a year.
Almost a year. And we won't go too much into how she's caught, but it's fairly easy to make the arrest after, I wouldn't say there was no connection made for a few of these murders, but there is some connection, and then it is fairly easy to make an arrest on Aileen Wuornos, and that is because of what evidence do they have? Do they have something in a database? What is the...
Well, they had an eyewitness of her and Tyria in one of the dead men's cars after after it crashed. So right. They had eyewitness description.
And of course, they were smart enough to speak with Tyria first and got the information and
yes, and
evidence.
That's how they got a taped confession over the phone, because Tyra was begging her to turn herself in.
Now, the interesting part is, and Aileen talks about this extensively in the letters, is that the police officers that are involved in this sting operation to get Aileen to confess to these murders, and tell us about what their involvement is over and beyond this case.
Well, they sort of decided that they would be great representatives to Hollywood for her, and sort of tried, one of them in particular tried sort of agenting her, and because someone had approached him, and so he was sort of brokering her story for her, along with a couple other cops who said they would write the screenplay. And so there was that faction sort of going ahead with that story, but there was someone else who had also approached Aileen for the rights to her story, and everything eventually got tied up in court.
Yes, incredible. And there's still more players to come into play. Wow. Now, the reuniting of Dawn and Aileen in terms of their correspondence doesn't start. When does that start again? I mean, there's 5 or 6 trials. We could spend an hour just on that process. But when is the relationship with Dawn and Aileen reunited in terms of this daily correspondence? What year does that start?
That would be in 1991.
Okay.
At the very end of 91.
Okay. And tell us about that first correspondence, the first initial. Obviously, who sent a letter to who, and what was involved, what was entailed in that letter, and how did it begin?
Sure. Well, apparently a state trooper came to Dawn's house sometime around the time of Eileen's arrest and said, do you know this woman? And she was had very mixed feelings, but a lot of relief finding out that Aileen was in jail, because she was always worried that she would turn up dead, and, wondering if she was sheltered and wondering if she was out in the rain by herself, if she was frightened. So Dawn asked the policeman to get her address, and Dawn wrote to her while she was waiting her trial.
So from her very first trial, they corresponded and then began this daily correspondence?
Yeah, sometimes multiple letters a day. They were limited to 4-page letters. Aileen was limited to 4-page letters at a time, so she would write many 4-page letters in this really lovely shell-like perfect script to Dawn. There are breaks in there. There are days. There are, I think, the longest that it seems like there's a week where they don't write, 2 weeks. But in general, they're writing daily.
Now, why did Dawn Botkins, and obviously she's married to, that wasn't her maiden name, and Botkins is her married name, and she has a family. She has a husband. And, of course, this is, again, everybody knows who Aileen Wuornos is. It's all over the news worldwide, and especially in America. Why does Dawn do this, and what is the reaction from her family? But more importantly, why does she feel important, this friendship she had for a few years at this time? Why does she feel it's important for her to make the time and write these letters to her friend?
I think she knew that Aileen needed her. And I think she did it in the name of love. And I think it really is, on a gut level, that simple. I mean, I think for anyone there would be sort of some horror at knowing someone who was capable of these things. But I think also it's sort of a family thing.
Now, was there any conditions that Dawn Botkins said for her own sort of legal safety or for her own conscience? Was there anything she instructed Aileen to say or not say in these letters?
No, I can't. You mean in the editing of the book?
No. I mean in terms of when they started corresponding. She didn't say, listen, I don't want to know about the murders. I don't care if you're innocent.
Oh, no.
I don't care.
No, not at all. And in fact, I think towards the end there was some consideration because, Aileen, again, was trying to write these letters in the hopes that Dawn could cash in on them. And those are her words, to cash in. So she was writing an expose of the crooked cops. She called them the crooked cops, the cops who were, again, trying to cash in on her story, try and sell it to Hollywood, and about everyone who was manipulating her and trying to make money off her story, and that was called Sound Off, her expose. So there was Sound Off, and she also was very aware, I think, that the stories of the killings was what everyone would want. Those were, for lack of a better phrase, the money shot. And she repeatedly tries to write them. And, I guess readers will see what they see, what she chooses to reveal about them in the book. But as far as legally saying anything, No, there were never any, hey, you might not want to say this because. Mm-hmm. She did redact her letters. This is one of the things that we couldn't reproduce in the book. She would draw these big black bars everywhere and redact her own letters, censor them herself. But she would also draw these amazing smiley faces and frowny faces and cartoon characters in the margins. And that was something else that we were not able to reproduce, sadly.
Right.
So I got a little bit
and I wanted to ask you about that, too, because she does write in a letter that she claims that Arlene did sell some of her drawings.
Mm-hmm.
So I hadn't known anything about drawings before your book, so I said, well, I have to ask about that.
Yeah, she was actually a very talented artist. She would do these wonderful drawings from prison with pen and ink. And she did them so that if you held them up to the light, you could see them. If you looked at it sort of lying down, it would just look like a dark sheet of paper. But it would have been a white sheet of paper that, you know, she had covered every single pore of, so that when you held it up to the light, it was like stained glass. You'd see her favorite was a ship, and she called it Sail La Vie. And she liked drawing houses a lot. She has one of an eagle that she was very proud of.
Now, in the letters, you have the gambit, like you've just spoken about. There was no boundaries in terms of what could be written in those letters. So there was everything from their early life and her reminiscing about the good old times in the pits and with neighborhoods. And she asked about, well, how about this person? How about that person? How are this person doing? She talked about being by her side with her brother that was dying of cancer, I believe. And so she talked about everything.
Mm-hmm.
Grammatically a little rough, and of course her spelling could be much better. But again, obviously there's some poignancy to this stuff. I mean, it's obviously very interesting.
I think that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say that it's amazing that with a ninth grade education that she would be so prolific and write so much and so expressively, because I think that, from the kinds of questions you're asking and the emotional response that you had, she obviously was able to express herself and communicate pretty effectively.
Mm-hmm. Well, absolutely. Well, the thing is that the one thing that she did achieve, and I think this was interesting, is that it totally was not under her control, but I think at times she felt that it was. When they start offering money, when there was large sums of money bandied about for TV appearances. Now, the other thing that we got to mention, too, for everybody that doesn't know this, and most true crime readers do know this, there's a Son of Sam law, which makes this, again, we didn't talk about that, but it makes it more than a conflict of interest when police officers and prosecutors, and we'll get to Arlene Prail and we'll get to Steve Glazer, too, because I think that's an amazing story, too, and that would send me around the bend if I had to deal with Steve Glazer, I think. But, the thing is that all of these things are in the letter. Well, let's get to Arlene Prail and Steve Glazer, too, because I think it's important we get to these people as well, because this, again, like I was saying, this is a real source of consternation for Aileen throughout the years in prison. Tell our audience about Arlene Prail, how she came into the picture and under what circumstances, and then Steve Glazer.
Okay, Arlene Prail is a horse rancher, I believe, trainer in Florida, who was reading her newspaper one morning and saw a photo of Aileen and thought, I was put on this earth to help her. And I think actually Nick Broomfield does a great job of profiling both her and Steve Glazer in both of his documentaries. But so she and Aileen became very close very quickly. She was a born-again Christian, which Aileen soaked up because, she could be redeemed. She could be washed clean of her sins, and she could be forgiven. And eventually Arlene adopted Aileen so that, when they got closer to the execution, Arlene would have visitation rights that were not contestable. And
right.
Glazer was the attorney who was originally in charge of that and who became Eileen's attorney for her court cases after that, even though he'd never worked on a capital case or I think maybe even a criminal case.
Yeah, and certainly not even a murder trial.
Right.
And the thing was, too, that I'm going to have to ask you if this was true, because, again, this is something I didn't remember. He tried to get her to sign an agreement that she would waive all rights to any other kinds of appeals or trials. So basically, because that's kind of a rule of publishing, you got to get the trial done if it's still hanging in the air with appeals and possible no conviction. Unbelievably, this guy would be her attorney, but then representing her in the publishing world and then doing what's best for the movie and the book.
Yeah, he did have her waive off the trials, and that actually became with later on that became potential, contested grounds for a retrial that was denied. But
right.
She did waive off, and it may be because of the Hollywood connection and the ending that was desired. It may be because they thought it was futile. I can't say what Steve Glazer's strategy was, but I can absolutely say with confidence that it was not to her benefit.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, well, that's to say the least. Now, what's interesting is that she, like you say, she goes from how you doing and the good old days. So her letters have all kinds of information in that letter, and like you say, it's the gambit of her mood as well. And so she'll go into sort of fiery anger in her letters a little bit, but then reminisce about some good old times too. So do you have some choice letters that you normally would read? Because I'd love to get the audience to hear exactly her voice.
Sure, I can find one really quickly. There's one that I particularly like that is about when she first is when she's first in the prison. Let me see if I can find this really quickly. In the meantime, I can't find the one I want. Let me see what I got just quickly at the beginning. Okay. I had it queued up, and now... Okay, here's one. This is from October 19th, 1992. Dear Dawn, as I've told you before, all of the scenes of the crime and the way things were left, you could tell it was self-defense and not a serial killer style. They mutilate and stuff. None of this occurred. And everyone knows that 22 is for shooting birds. They're like BBs. Therefore, one shot would never do a thing. And the assailant would still be fighting with you after 3 shots, even after 5, like Humpty. He had my gun as I held it positioned to my head, tried to get the trigger pulled down if my finger was pulled down on it. While he was shot at least 5 times already, almost with good strength still left in him, succeeded, which I would have been shot in my eye, my right eye, during the struggle of defense 22s. 22s don't do shit, not with a 225 around or better-sized man who's in a crazed state of wanting to do the things he wanted to do to me in the first place, and now shot even madder than that. So you can imagine the bullets didn't even faze him until the wounds started to take effect. These cops know this. These state attorneys know this, as well as others, but everyone's trying to hide the truth of the matter. 22s are shit for defense, even with hollow points. 22's numerous shots have to be fired in order to stop an attacker. Plus, of their hollow point being carved out in the middle leaves even less of a bullet, and this is how big they are. Just that big. The top doohickey is the bullet. There was a drawing there in the letter. The shell consists of the gunpowder and remains in the chamber after firing. And check this out. Carskadden had hollow points in his .45. 45 bullets look like this. Yeah, that's what he was going to blow my brains out with, right in the side of my temple. Now you can see why I unloaded my weapon with 9 shots in him as he held his gun trying to shoot me. Only thing is, he forgot to slide a bullet into the chamber when he slipped the clip in the handle. This is what he was trying to do, slide it over as I was shooting him. I constantly shot him so as to make him lose power or drop his gun so he couldn't slide it over. Now, I never knew he had hollow points until I got home and never knew how a .45 worked until Tyria showed me. And that's how I learned why he was lying there trying to slide the gun steel across. And if I was such a serial killer and having the .45 besides my .22, why didn't I switch weapons? Also, when I dumped my .22 in Rose Bay, I still had his .45, yet I looked for 5 more weeks without a gun. Tyria knows this. The gun was put in storage. Also, I hustled without a gun before she left, just taking chances regardless because I needed to pay off our rent and get food, etc. Shit, it's the 4th page. Gotta go. Another letter to follow. Love, Lee.
Yeah, it's really hard to sort the fact from the fiction. You're not really sure. It sounds compelling, but nobody in their right mind would talk that, because it would be off-putting to authorities that you knew that much about weaponry and bullets.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But she's oblivious to that, so it's...
Well, the thing is, she's not talking to authorities. She's talking to someone who knows less about weaponry. So she's bandying it about. She's playing expert. She's giving a lesson, if you will, to Dawn in what a hero she is to have survived a harrowing circumstance, which may or may not have happened quite like that.
Now, I know this is probably maybe wasn't even your purpose, and it certainly wasn't your purpose, or it wasn't the criteria, and it wasn't necessary. But in all these letters, the mix of fact and fiction and delusion and in the end, like you say, when she's disintegrating, but everything considered, and you've pored over these letters, I'm sure, like nobody else really has, other than Dawn. Is there anything? What do you think about what really happened? Is there any evidence at all? Is there any possibility in your mind that one of these men possibly? Is there any evidence in your mind, based on everything that you've read, the consistency or lack of consistency? Is there something to that? Because she has said at one time that, in part of her rationale, that it was a preemptive thing after a couple of men that were obviously going to kill her or rape her or attempted to rape her. What do you think in terms of, or was that even important to you in terms of how much of this is true?
Well, I think it's important to me as someone who's listening to her to believe everything and nothing she says at once, but to listen very carefully for openers. I also think that it's important to say, because I think what you're getting at ultimately is, what happened to her for her in her head. There's no question that she had PTSD. There is also no question to me that a working prostitute on the road could be raped 7 times in a year. That is not debatable to me. That's fairly obvious. There is no question to me in my mind that you could kill 7 men in self-defense as a prostitute in 1 year, and that's not that's not crazy. That's not outlandish.
Okay.
I think that I'm not saying that that's what's happened at all. I think that Mallory being a sexual offender, it is pretty likely, or not likely, but it's entirely plausible that he was aggressive with her in inappropriate, at least, and probably illegal ways. And it is probable that, to me, what I think is that she got triggered and that she thought her life was in danger in each of those occasions. I don't think she was a vengeance killer. I don't think she was looking for retribution. I don't think she was, trying to kill Daddy over and over. But I do think that she was responding to danger, and whether or not the danger was present or it happened 2 years ago or 10 years ago or 20, it was happening in that moment for her.
Right.
I think that it is important to say that for every there's never been an Aileen Wuornos before, but it's important, I think, to say that there were that year 128 prostitutes killed. And, you know, we can look at someone like the Green River Killer who killed 48 prostitutes. And, you know, Lonnie Franklin Jr., now the Grim Sleeper, who is also linked to at least 48 killings, and Joel Rivkin and William Suff, and all of them killed prostitutes. So I think that it's I wouldn't go as far as poetic justice, but I think that it's kind of surprising what an anomaly it is, how shocked everyone is that a prostitute could kill, given that it's open season on them.
Right, I see what you mean. Yeah, it's a point. And there is sort of a mix too of her reasoning. Like you say, there's the sex offender. Mallory being a sex offender does give some evidence that, of course, was not used at trial. His status as a sex offender was not used, and ironically or weirdly, the other way, the other killings were used to establish a pattern with the first, so negating that. And again, with the conflicts of interest, with the inexperienced defense lawyers, with Aileen's own maneuvering at trial in terms of firing people that were working on her behalf, everything
well,
was
I think that's part of the borderline thing. She didn't know who to trust, and, you know, she correctly did not know who to trust half the time, but she also was, because of her borderlineness, hiring and firing and hiring and firing, and I think just reaching for any ounce of control she could get under the circumstances. But I don't think that worked to her benefit.
The other thing that she put in her letters, and I think that it's very plausible too, and I think a lot of people might not have sympathy for people in prison, especially killers, but again, the one thing that Aileen Wuornos could do is communicate her ideas. There was a fieriness to her dialogue, to her writing, but it was also very plausible, some of this stuff, and that was her behavior or the behavior of the correctional staff or the guards, and her rough ride that she had in prison, and that's illustrated in the letters too. Tell us a little bit about that, because she imparted a lot of information to Dawn about that.
Well, sure. I mean, there was just generally the bureaucracy of prison, which was, you know, in terms of packages and mailing packages. There was also abuse, straight up abuse, that was later investigated. And I don't actually know the outcome, but I believe someone was fired on account of it. She believed that people were putting ground glass in her food. She believed that things were being poisoned. She thought that people were spitting in her food. She thought that they were listening through her intercom and pumping sonic pressure, what she called sonic pressure, into her cell.
Yeah, so her complaints would fall on deaf ears anyway, because if there was any semblance of credibility, then whatever she said about the other paranoid delusions would sort of negate that, right? So
right, which is really complicated. You know, when she asked Dawn to go to the press, and she's going to blow the roof right off the prison. You know, the talks that there's a satellite on the compound is sort of might demote the importance of that claim.
What's interesting with this story too, and we should convey too, is that she went to, like I say, had 6 trials or 5 trials, and then appeals subsequently denied. But she had the death sentence early on. Then she seemed to sort of had people in her corner that thought maybe they had those grounds for appeal. So there was a little bit of hope. But then she was still on death row. So in terms of anyone, whether they were sane or completely sane, the vulnerability that this person felt at that time with all these people trying to get deals for books, and there certainly was a few books and movies made from this, and but yet Aileen was still wanted to tell her story. Dawn Botkins finally, with her MS advancing, she wanted to get this done. What is Dawn's view, or what was Dawn's view about this in terms of what the end product was, this book, in terms of those letters and what you had done with them?
I think she's been really, really pleased in the letters, and I think she's been really relieved that they're out and that the promise that she made to her friend has been fulfilled. I think she wishes that she was getting more money for it because I think times are kind of tight for her. But and for our part, we're hoping, to sell a few copies so that we can get the money to her. But I think that mostly, she was able to sort of consecrate a period of time and maybe the most important relationship in her life, and spend time with her again.
And so Aileen would be happy if Dawn would be happy with the end result, and I'm sure that Aileen would be happy that at least something in her life turned out and she had control of and worked out the way she would want it anyway.
And I think it did. I think that's right.
Yeah, I think it's a sad life, and I don't really feel sorry for killers or serial killers. I really don't. But in terms of circumstances, this is a story that's, I wouldn't say heartbreaking for me, but it certainly is a real recipe for disaster in terms of putting all the events that could possibly happen. And again, I still question, and that's why I asked the question, what you thought as a result of this, because Aileen Wuornos has a compelling argument, and when you see all the machinations that were behind the scenes in the court cases, I don't know. I'm not really convinced that she did get a fair trial. And again, I just looking at that at face value, it is an interesting story where everybody has a vested interest in something, whether it's politics or money or position, and really skewered this case. I think there was. I don't think this is a perfect case for women's rights groups or any of those groups that we mentioned, but it does touch on that.
Yeah, and as I said, it was a chance to re-embody her and spend some time with her, which I didn't know it would be 4 years when I took this on, and I didn't know we'd be keeping such close company for such a long time. But I am very grateful to have her in my life, and I'm surprised how much she's in my head.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting.
It's sort of funny to have a serial killer rattling around in your head, but
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a different kind of serial killer, and like you say, the female serial killer is why it really interests people, because, like you say, the motivation is completely different.
Yeah.
They're completely different stories than the male serial killer. Absolutely. So now, you have a website for this book or for the publisher? Maybe you can tell us, our audience, about that.
Absolutely. The website is in progress, but you can get it at www.dear-dawn.com.
Okay, great. And is it in ebook form as of yet?
That's a really good question. I think it is. In fact, I know it is.
Okay, great. That's a very growing audience, so it's nice to have that in that format for sure for those people that are wanting to get an ebook form. So it's great.
I think it reads well in that form.
Yes, absolutely. I want to thank you very much, Daphne, for coming on and talking about this book, Dear Dawn. It's a completely unique perspective. I, as you know, interview people writing their true crime books, and we obviously have different people, lawyers. We've had Crown attorneys talking about cases, wrongful convictions, people, John Wayne Gacy's lawyer. But it is very unique to have in the killer's words the person that was involved, and again get so much humanity from this person, getting a glimpse into their early life and their life behind bars, desperate to get the word out, desperate to keep a connection with a friend, and like you say, it really is a testament to love. Each letter she signs off with "Love Lee," and you could see that the bond that they had, and it is really, really very, very evident in the letters and in this book. So I applaud you for being able to get that and get that message across, and I think it's very evident that this was a very important project to you. So I want to thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you, and thank your listeners for having me.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and you have yourself a good evening.
Thanks, you too. Bye-bye.
Good night.